Hey, everybody. We're back. We're back in action. And we have more class discussions for you. Uh, what do we got today, Victor?
Well, today we've got the Bard, and before we get into the origin of the actual term, I feel like this might be the most important one to clearly define because I feel like the Bard, in many ways, it is either the butt of jokes or presented as something it might not be or completely misunderstood. And not to say that there isn't plenty of jokes and such to be made around the bard, but I feel a lot of the time the fact that people don't have a clear view of what a bard actually is beyond some sort of stereotype is very detrimental. If you look at a barbarian, you have Conan the Barbarian, which is the like archaic prime example,
Mm-hmm.
like the archetypal example, and people have an idea what that kind of character does, but who's the archetypical bard?
Yeah. Ironically,
Yeah,
Conan's actually more of like a fighter rogue. But yes,
technically,
but
but
like straight
but it gives an idea
symbolism.
of what.
Yeah, with
Yeah,
just straight symbolism, he's very much I mean,
yeah,
it's in the name, right? Conan the Barbarian.
yeah,
But we're not talking about
and
barbarians, so I apologize for that.
yeah, and a lot of there's various elements of the bard that a lot of people feel doesn't fit with one image or one another image of what the bard is. So we'll hopefully be able to clear that out today. Now, getting into the definitions, what is a bard? Well, originally, the word bard referred to a storyteller in Gaelic and British tradition that was an upholder of oral traditions and oral history. That is to say, the one who remembers what's happened before there is proper writing and record keeping. This is in say a barbarian culture or whatever you want to refer to it. These are the wise old men who keep track of track of the history. And later during medieval times, it was defined as as a technically lower class poet and holder of oral traditions, and they were lower class in relation to the religious
Mm.
keepers of memories and traditions. The bard were the one who kept the memories of stories, while the more clerical ones were the ones who held on to the faith and the traditions and beliefs.
Yeah.
And as reading and writing became more commonplace and the bardic traditions started to die out, it came to be redefined as a general meaning of an author or a minstrel, specifically famous ones. For Shakespeare is generally referred to as the great bard, for example. So a bard can, in this definition, be referred to as a great writer or someone who is famous for some sort of entertainment
Yeah,
work.
yeah. So that's a lot to unpack, and I think
Yeah,
going through this portion of it, I think is the most important for you, especially if you're trying to find how bards work in your setting. Uh, you know, we're generally going to be talking about 5e all the time in regards to this, but you also have the 5e aspects of colleges and things that you have to take into consideration. But we won't go too far into that just yet. We'll wait for later. But uh, bards are very intriguing because inherently, if you kind of understand, if you had understood before we went into it, or now you have a better understanding of what bards are historically, you understand that bards actually have a huge there's a professional requirement of them, almost like a cultural requirement of them, that they are the ones that keep the history and they keep it alive. They're the orators. They bring the past to life in front of others and continue that on for generation. They are arguably one of the most important aspects of contemporary human society to get us to this point before we had the technology to do it for us. They were the kind of like the first people that lost their jobs to new technology. um, so
yeah,
it's incredibly impressive what a bard actually is meant to be historically, and I think that that just heavy nature of historical imperative I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're trying to get a little bit more of a serious setting and pull more emphasis out of your setting. If you don't really take a hard look at a bard and what bards mean for your setting, I know for me personally, and we'll go into kind of what I do narratively. Bards are basically the only way to get information anywhere. Bards are the ones that, like, you pay them, they will go and either pass messages, carry letters. They're kind of like a quasi minstrel storyteller / post office. It's kind of like the bardic pledge that if you pay a bard and you give them a message, they will take it or pass it on to somebody within the bardic tradition that will take it to where it needs to go. It may take months for you to get your message across, but that is what the bardic pledge is. Obviously, there are ne'er-do-wells and bad actors and all things, but ideally, that's what the bards do to keep a good name about
the
being
ne'er-do-wells are the ones who break the oath.
Exactly. So, and that's what's so important to me. In my setting, basically nothing gets done without the bard. You don't have a reputation without the bard. So nobody really, bards are kind of like on a class above most. They're not quite nobility, but even nobility, shirks at the idea of pushing against the bards, because you are nothing without your reputation in these worlds. And to upset any, especially bardic guilds, which are not terribly common in my setting, but if bards come together, especially in large cities, bardic guilds can have huge emphasis because people are going to believe what they hear in the bars, and the bards are going to be the ones that are singing or telling your tales.
Yeah, but what was a big revelation to me when I was doing my research before this episode was that this is where the bardic insight or bardic knowledge comes from. The fact that they were the ones who remember stories, not just that they have stories, but that they, as a tradition, are the ones that remember things without pen and paper.
They are literally a repository of knowledge. Like that was historically their use, that they are the wisest among us because they have that, not only their lived experience, but ideally they have the lived experience of many because it's been put into them in stories.
Yeah, and how do you remember these stories? By putting them to music, to melodies, and to giving them a poetic meter that lets you remember how to get these things out and get the system in your head. Everybody knows that if you can put the answers to the test into a rhyme that you can remember when you're doing the test, it's going to be easier to get it done.
Yep.
And that's where the whole musical and entertainment and poetry elements come in. It all comes together quite nicely when you actually look at it. And many times the bard just looks like a lot of stuff that you can do, but none that is great. But that's the thing about the bard. It's the mechanical elements are there to support the narrative possibilities, as opposed to being the core of what the class is.
In media,
I feel anyway.
In general media, there's actually an example of a bard that I absolutely adore. I believe it was 2007 that the Hercules movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson came out. His nephew is basically my idea of a perfect bard. Slight spoilers here if you haven't seen the 2007 Hercules movie, but the whole movie is about the legend of Hercules, but what it puts on its head is that Hercules, it puts it kind of in a realistic sense where Hercules is actually not some demigod, but it was because of bardic lore and tradition that his nephew would push out at every tavern that they went to, that people began to almost fear or revere Hercules before he got there. And it's actually a band of mercenaries that Hercules is just the face of them. And he tells about defeating the Hydra or defeating the boar or the lion, which really it was all of them working together. And so, like, an instance, the Hydra was actually a band of rogues and brigands that just wore reptilian helmets. But when he killed all of them, he brought the heads to the emperor, and everybody just kind of, the story became, because of bardic tradition, that he severed the multi-headed Hydra that never seemed to run out of heads, because it was just a huge organization that they killed. And stories like this made it to where he became fantastical, and people would lay down arms before fighting him because they were afraid that they were fighting the son of Zeus. And it was all because not only did he have the strength and the comrades to pull it off, but a huge portion of that was his nephew telling people in bars, like, do not face the son of Zeus because you will fall. Like he is indestructible, impenetrable. He knows no end to his strength. And to me, that is like, you could bring so much emphasis into your campaigns by having a bard in a party or NPCs that maybe there is a lot of mundane stuff that's going on in your campaign, but the way that the bards tell it, or the peasants retell tales that they heard, it becomes fantastical. And you have almost that mystery line that goes through your campaigns of, well, is this really some kind of horrible troll or horrible monstrous wizard or lich? Or is it actually just something that's been misunderstood or purposefully brought up? What happens when the villain starts paying bards to tell the story of how much clout he has and how much power he has and how unbeatable he is when he actually has none of these things? This is, I think, the real juice of, because we have a game that is based in oraries, or sorry, we talk in these games, right? So one of the most impactful things that you can do in your campaign is make talking a huge part of it in game. So if you make stories and lies and intrigue and all these things, and if you infuse it directly into the campaign and how you guys deal at the table, I think that's where a lot of the juice comes from in these games, to make sure that you're really invested. Because when you're talking, the easiest thing to act like you're doing is actually talking.
Yeah, and I can clearly tell that you have, ironically, a lot of, I don't know, not ironically, but anyway, you have inspiration and passion for this topic.
I do. I love bards. Yeah. I love bards. Sorry, Will.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I talk a lot for long run on conversations with myself as well. But yeah, the bard has such a potential to be a driving force for a GM, and stories and such. They have so much potential that you can do so much with them, so long as you have a bard or a player with a player that is a bard that has some sort of interest in stories. Because, as you mentioned, a story can be completely accurate, it can be embellished, it can be downplayed. There can be so many things about a story that entices players to check something out, or inspires, or other things. And there is so much flexibility and possibility to it. And this also brings in the questions of, what is your bard's approach to, let's say, a story? What is the more important thing to your bard when you're making a bard? Is it that the story be told exactly like it was told to you, so that the memory remains intact? Mm-hmm. Or is it that the moral of the story is conveyed to the new generation in a way that the new generation understands? Or is it more important that the story be grandiose than real? Is it more important that the story serve your purpose or serve the purpose of your employer? Mm-hmm. There are so many there are so many different historical roles of where kings and lords and such have their own storytellers and story writers and such, that of course are not going to bad talk their master.
There are historical emphasis on naismiths, like jesters and things like that. But yes, yeah. Generally speaking, if you're under the hire of somebody, you're probably not going to bad talk them.
Yeah, and on the topic of poetry, Professor Dr. Crawford on YouTube has made a lot of video material on Norse poetry, and including the fact that in Iceland during, I can't remember if it was the 11th or 12th century, there were laws forbidding you from writing love poetry to someone you are not already wed to, because it was believed that these poems would have the power to actually make people fall in love with you, and thus the father of the family was going to have trouble marrying that person off to whoever they felt were more appropriate, and as such you had to be punished for causing them problems, and the punishment was death.
Damn. Wow.
Because the power of words was frankly considered magical.
Yeah.
And these kinds of rules and systems can be interesting to implement or have as part of your backstory or part of your world.
Yeah, I might be butchering this, but I recently heard that, probably multiple times I've heard it, but that charisma is actually derived from being a gift from God. That is, it is often believed that the ability to speak or to kind of almost charm people in a way is a lot of people believe it's unteachable and that it is literally a gift from God. I don't believe that. I think to a degree people can learn it, but
Yeah,
slightly off point.
yeah, it's certainly learnable to a degree, but there's also a big difference between those who have it by themselves and those who have to put it up
Yeah.
to use it rather than be it.
Yeah, and you talked about kind of the bard is something that is kind of become a butt of jokes, and
Yeah.
I think there are 2 points to why that may have happened. First, historically, bards have been mechanically lackluster. At least in the D&D spectrum, they've kind of always been, whether true or not, they have been seen as being kind of lesser among the classes in their capability. I point to mostly because they tend to be jack of all trades. So only taking the first half of that quote, basically average at all things but master at none.
Yeah, the
But
mechanical approach.
yeah, combined with the ever elusive and problem causing charisma stat. Among the stats, it is kind of king to people can't really get a good grasp, and even if they have a personal grasp, no one really agrees on what charisma actually stands for. Because these are all really all of them are nebulous and can be interchangeable to a degree if you really think about it. But the perceived uselessness and the nebulous nature of charisma for a lot of people combine together to create, I try to have sex with them. Like, I think.
Yeah,
I,
it comes down to that, because a lot of people who think if you don't think about the alternative solutions that a bard can provide, you're just going to use your abilities to do whatever else you can, which is convince people of things.
Yeah. And honestly, if you feel that you're playing a useless character or other people around you feel that you're useless and that's kind of weighing on you, you start to do things that are less than problem solving. You kind of just do things because they're funny. And what's funnier than having sex with a monster, I guess?
Well, some people think
And
that.
yeah,
Yes.
and if that's your thing and you enjoy it at the table,
Yeah.
then by all means have fun. Do play your fun. We're not here to tell you otherwise, but we also like to talk about why we think and kind of dissect why these things happen in our cultural zeitgeist when it comes to the games, because I think understanding them is also important in not only allowing people to kind of understand their own fun, but understand if it's your goal to avoid that, how to go about that. I think 5e has done a pretty good job of making bards a lot more useful. So
Yeah. It takes figuring out what to do with them a little bit, and I don't mean that in the sense of optimization, but in the sense of knowing when to do what, because you could do so many things.
Yep.
There's also we got into this a little bit. We mentioned how characters in the video on barbarians, we talked a lot about culture and where does your character come from, and that is also a relevant question here, because where does your bard come from? If your bard comes from a culture that literally doesn't have reading and writing, they probably have a fairly high status, because they are the ones who remember. If your bard comes from a civilization where where there's enough paper for people to literally have toilet paper, and everybody knows how to write, they have to find a different role. And that's where the minstrelling element starts coming in. And so it's interesting to ask yourself what role does this character fill in this culture?
Yeah, I definitely believe that if I'll probably say this every time, so I'll become a broken record. But when you select a bard, that is a very important choice. Like that is an impactful choice. Just selecting that class, because it means so much for the world itself. Has your DM thought about what a bard even means in their world, how it interacts with the world? Because I know we like to sometimes play where it's just mechanisms. It's just I throw a bardic inspiration and sometimes we do Song of Rest, But to me, the emphasis is on being a bard has so much wider aspects, because we can do combat, we can have almost like combative encounters of social interaction, But really, where the juice comes from is that general every session kind of when you're talking to other characters or NPCs, and what spurs that. And a bard is probably going to be the one who narratively has the most reason to talk to people, either in the party or outside the party, because that's their job. Their job is to either collect knowledge or pass on knowledge. That is kind of, I think, the core premise of the bard, and you can't really escape it unless you really try and you try to kind of like throw some things away. The core premise is gaining knowledge and passing knowledge. Anything
Yes.
against that?
No, I would absolutely agree that there's a lot to that, because even in the player's handbook, they mentioned that there's a lot of people that can be minstrels, there's a lot of people that can be storytellers, but there's only so many people who are actually bards.
Mm-hmm.
And a bard is a step beyond both of these things individually.
Yeah.
Because there is something more to it.
Yeah.
And on the topic of like knowledge and stories and such, there's also another interesting question you can ask yourself as a character when you are playing, and that is, does your character, your bard, are they more interested in being there to write down the story, and that's why they go adventuring? Do they want to be in the story, and that's why they go out adventuring, because they want to be part of all these stories that one of these stories like the ones they've memorized? Just like someone who works in academics might think, I want to be able to write my own book on the subject someday and have my book be part of the curriculum for later generations in this profession.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, to what degree do they kind of infuse their own artistic license into those stories, whether they see them or a part of? Often, I like the idea of a bard who really puts a lot of flowery language, really emboldens what the story was. A simple combat against slathering undead could be this wonderful stand of heroism and protecting those of love's loss, and all these things, because a bard puts a spin on it. I don't necessarily think that you as a player need to be skilled in doing so. I encourage you to lean on your DM in those regards. Like, hey, I would like to paint a beautiful story about what happened. I do not personally feel I'm skilled enough. I would also encourage your DM to kind of push you to try, because you only get good at something as you try. But, maybe after you give your spiel and what you think is this flowery language, the DM, spackles a little bit on the edges and gives a little bit more flourish to it on the sides. And you work together, because we're collaborative storytelling. We're working together on this. And
maybe your character, as that could be an element of character development as well as
they're still not good at it.
Where you as a character, maybe you're specialized in remembering stories, but you're trying to get good at actually writing stories. So what you're specialized in is generally is reminding people of the great legends of old and the great achievements of others, but you are struggling with trying to write down your own.
Yeah.
And that is part of your own development as a player in trying to learn to write these poems or rhythms or stories, or however you want to put it down. Whatever you feel is more akin to you. And even as you or yourself are trying different things to see am I better at this, that could be part of your character as well. Mm-hmm. A parallel development between you and your character. That is an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I do like that a lot. I also like the idea of a bard that whenever a situation comes about and the party is trying to make a decision and weigh different options, that the bard seems to always chime in with a story about, either something that they've experienced or been told, or maybe they're coming up with it on the spot. You never actually quite know where you stand with the bard and the realism of their story, but it doesn't matter, because it's something morally weighty and important to the subject at hand, that they are weighing in with what feels like historical significance.
Yeah, and I think another important thing to think about with the bard as well is that while they are often the butt of jokes, or the more like silly or more lighthearted character in many ways, I feel like they can do the things that a rogue many times can't in terms of plotting and planning and stuff, because a bard can put on the show and put on the character and be all these things, and meanwhile have a master plan in the back of their heads. Mm-hmm. I remember in one of Yahtzee, Benjamin Crocshaw, who makes the Zero Punctuation, in one of his books, he has written, there's a character, I can't remember the exact name of the story, the book right now, but there's a character in there called Slippery John, and he's a rogue, and generally the theme of him is that he tends to always make it out, but he's a kind of a klutz in many ways, and he talks about himself in the third person and stuff. But I'm going to raise spoiler fingers for a few seconds because I'm going to point something out. I'll lower the fingers when the spoiler is over. Towards the end of the book, you realize that the entire klutziness and his entire role of being this guy that isn't quite good is entirely played up because he is trying to avoid being controlled by the players, which are the fact that this is a digital MMO world. And he realizes that I need to be the silly character no one actually wants to play, even though I am very, very, very good at what I do.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. It does bring about a part of the bard that I don't think I've ever seen explored. There are no new ideas, so I'm sure it's been explored 100 times. But the idea of the idea of theater is that comedy and tragedy are one on the same spectrum. A bard, I imagine, especially the way I run bards, that a bard lives a pretty rough life because much of human, I use human in a vague term right now because we're talking about fantasy settings, but a very human experience is that of tragedy. And how do you get the information that somebody has died in war or that a town has been destroyed and other people need to know? A bard probably carries with them not only stories of tragedy, but actual lived tales and messages of tragedy. And a bard may give themselves off as this carefree, very charismatic individual, but it could also have a very heavy heart on them, and that's kind of how they deal with it, by putting on a brave face for everybody else. That they are most likely, a bard, especially a venerable bard, has probably been in the face of horrible tragedies their whole life.
I just thought of a good kind of example right now for a character that could very well be level 1. You could have a character that has in the past been the employed storyteller and remembrancer for some sort of lord or king or something, and then there's a dispute and the king dies. And this bard is so insignificant that the killers choose not to deal with them. And the bard knows the true story of how the king died, or the leader, or the lord, but that might not necessarily be the one they tell. But they are also, now they don't have a lord anymore. What am I going to do? I guess I'll go out traveling. And there you have an introduction for a whole new character.
It could be an interesting thing where a bard has to decide what is more important, the legacy or the truth. That the legacy of that lord that you speak of might be more important and to hide the truth away, how much that person meant to their people. Now, maybe the lord died in some way that would have besmirched that legacy. The bard has to make a decision. Do I tell the truth so that people understand, or do I uphold that legacy and that posthumous glory so that the people can live in peace and happiness? And that is something.
Is this a story I'm going to refuse to tell for as long as I can because I cannot tell a lie?
Yeah.
I cannot make myself tell a story and tell a lie because that breaks my personal oath to the bardic code. Or something.
I might have a really deep kinship with bards because I believe that D&D is, I truly believe it is a collaborative storytelling venture. And I think nothing is more indicative of that in D&D than the bard itself. I think the bard is... In many ways, there's many facets to being a dungeon master, but I think the bard might be the most easy insert for a DM. That the bard is effectively the DM after the fact. That he tells the story that happened, but he has full control about how that story is told.
Yeah, and a bard can be such a driving force for a GM in so many ways, and there are so many levels that you can implement the bard for whatever plot or storyline or such that you are making. There is always the bard can always be a good resource for the GM for their story elements.
And
that,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that is also one of the things about bards. There is talk about how, oh, you're just a bard, you can't see this or that or the other thing, or then, the whole mechanical approach of why should I play a bard when any one class can do the one thing I want to do better. Well, yeah, that's because the bard is not about that one thing. The bard is about the whole package. The bard is about, and the bard is beyond mechanics, about the story and the characters and the world and the lore and all that stuff. And the mechanistic approach and the more, shall we say, vitalistic approach of story and world doesn't necessarily marry too well at all times. And those who have a strong incentive for one or the other don't necessarily marry the parts always.
Yeah. And I would be remiss not to mention some 5e specifics and mechanical aspects of the bard, because we did do that with the barbarian. We talked about rage and things like that. I do think that you and your DM have to take some time to think about what the colleges mean to you. Is this more of an idea that it's kind of that more back to the orator aspect of bards, that there's no true establishment of college, but a way of teaching among bards where they pass down how to learn and how to spread that, so you have the College of Lore versus Valor, all these different colleges are actually just ways of bards thinking and perceiving situations. I'm more fond of that than actual physical colleges, and I almost find it as like a hilarious conceit, because bards have a weird space if you have wizards in the world.
I've never felt like college is the correct term for it. It's more like tradition.
I have run that bards only call it a college to be a joke to wizards, that they call it a college and wizards don't get the joke most of the time. They're like, well, where's this college at? And they're just like, you know what, you'll never, it's too far, you don't have to worry about it. There's no actual college.
It's like it's like that weird transition, but it's like that Family Guy song about the FCC that is full of implicated swear words, and the FCC loved it.
Yes.
It's like, don't you get it?
But I like the idea that bards have kind of they were like the original arcane casters, like the OG, and then wizards came along and they kind of own it. They do it, they do it to a much higher degree. They have the repositories of knowledge that are physical, and so to kind of stick,
it's like the comparable between a campfire storyteller and a writer. The writer will be famous, but the campfire storyteller can give you an experience.
Yeah, and the wizard owes everything to the bard. Traditionally owes everything to the bard. So I love the idea that the bards kind of stick it to them just a little bit. Be like, you would be nowhere without us. Like knowledge would be nothing if it wasn't for us. And the bards are kind of not necessarily on the way out, but technologically, wizards are on the apex.
Yeah, their role has to be adjusted and changed to make sure that they have a position in a world where knowledge can be preserved without the word, without the spoken word.
Yeah, and that's, for me, that's a nice little conceit that I have with the college idea. It's no true college. Maybe there are bardic guilds, but they don't go and like learn classes on how to be a bard or anything like that.
I prefer to think of them as bardic very bardic traditions, or bardic, not schools, but like ways of and approaches.
Yeah, I think tradition is
but the word is a bit vague.
Yeah, I think tradition is very apt. I think that's a very apt description of it. So a huge part about being a bard is bardic inspiration, and much like I suggest to all players about spellcasting, I do the same thing about our bardic inspiration, which is for the bard, you have to do both. How does that manifest? How does that look? I've had bards that when they do spellcasting or they do their bardic inspiration, it's based on the way that they whistle and they weave their magic influence. I think one of the most common bardic inspirations is literally just like you say good things about them or put good feelings into them. That's pretty common. But really break down what bardic inspiration is for you. Is it physical? Is it metaphysical? Is it something that is like quite literal? literal. You're just like, you're doing well. Like,
Yeah, like
think
you can
about it.
think of your bard as a drill sergeant who
Yeah.
knows what words to piss that warrior off enough that they'll stand right back up and hit the enemy in the
Yeah,
face,
I
even
think
though
that
they just got hurt.
I think it works really well for like Valor and sword bards.
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah,
a really good way to do it.
yeah. And then of course there you can also have the one where there's of course the minstrelly approach where you do a little rhyme or a sing-song thing, and there's of course also the approach where and this works very well if the other players have a backstory and like the things that they idealize, that your character reminds them of something
Yeah.
that they
A
like
quick
a story of their youth about a mighty warrior that they idealize or something.
a quick
Like
haiku or limerick about what they have done or what they want to
Yeah.
aspire to.
Yeah, like if you as a bard player, and I feel like if you're gonna play a bard and do it well, you don't necessarily need to be able to sing or do poetry or any of these things, but you need to be a bit passionate about about the lore and the world and the story and such
And
to
your
some
other
extent.
and the other characters in your party.
Yeah,
That should be
and the other characters.
They
That's
need,
what I was getting to.
yes,
Because
yes.
if you know the other characters and what actually motivates them, you can make your bardic inspiration be genuinely inspiring on so many levels.
Yeah, and kind of on a meta level, when you're talking outside of the game, and specifically, one of the things that makes people more excited about playing is when they see you're excited about their character. And a bard, his job, arguably, is to be liked. So if
Yeah,
he's
the
taking,
bard-
go ahead.
Yeah, like how to be a great GM did a video on bards a while. I don't know how long back, but there was one statement there that I feel was almost glossed along. But the statement was the bard is hope.
Mm-hmm.
The bard is the spirit of the party and the one who drives. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Drives motivation and story and such along.
Yeah, and I think taking that inspiration from other people and getting them excited about their characters, and it could be quick little things. Maybe one time for one character a session. When you use, it doesn't have to be every time you use the mechanic, but you remind them of one of their goals or their traits or their bonds or something, remind them of why they're out here and doing that. I think that can have such a huge impact, not only for your general play and making your character seem more interesting, but it will make your party actually come together. The players specifically will bond more easily because you're putting emphasis on other people, and that's one of the easiest way to ingratiate people is to put emphasis on them.
Yeah, a good bard is in many ways the heart of a group because they drive everyone to want to aspire further.
Yes. So the same thing goes with the spell casting. Make sure you're describing. It doesn't have to be every time you cast a spell, but every once in a while, especially if you have a flourish to put on it for a different spell, describe how that spell casting manifests. If it's musical, if it's more of the arcane notion, whatever it is, there's no right answer for any of this, but make it yours. Make it interesting. Make it exciting for people. Song of Rest. I think that's another thing that is taking short rest and things like that are woefully underrepresented at the table. It's like, okay, use your hit dice, and then that's basically the end of the conversation. But short rest would arguably be the times where people are chatting the most. And that Song of Rest might just be the bard putting everybody at ease. It's not literally a strumming song. Maybe it is some idle strumming, but it's the idea that the bard is either telling a story or reminding everybody why they're here and why they're doing that, or for things to come of what will happen.
Yeah, being the confident, assured face in the face of a grim scenario where everyone's feeling down, and the bard is the one who stands proud and makes sure everyone is still on the case, so to speak. And that is the kind of character that also you can have a whole lot of development of. I need to keep this face up because I need to drive everyone else. But what happens if I falter?
Yeah. I've been replaying through Darkest Dungeon, and if there's ever a setting where somebody like a bard is invaluable, it is in the doldrums of a horrible, almost oppressive dark dungeon. So
Oh yeah.
a bard being with you can be that bolstering light that you need. And I would urge players to not underappreciate their own bards or bards that they're playing.
Yeah, there's so much potential, and it it kind of breaks my heart when I see bards just played as the frisky guy with a lute.
On one end, I love laughing.
Yeah,
So, you
yeah,
know, a dumb joke here and there, I will, you know, I'll be doubled over with you. But yeah, at the table, it's a whole different animal.
yeah. Or in, especially if it's in a long campaign and the character
Yes.
doesn't really develop
Yeah.
beyond that or show that there's actually more to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
The
yeah,
trope is not the
there's
problem itself. It's the trope by itself that's the problem.
yeah, yeah. It's when there's nothing. It's when you can't peel off that layer and see something more underneath.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's anything that we missed out on or skipped out on?
No, we didn't talk a lot about the whole minstrelly bit, but I feel like that's already been done to death in other ways. So
Yeah.
I think we've covered everything more
And
or less.
and I worry the minstrel part of it, that unless you're very skilled at singing or playing instruments and things like that, and even at the table, it's still time consuming. There's not really anybody else can do anything while you're singing,
Yeah,
even a
it's the
1 minute song.
It's the kind of thing you do in between or after sessions,
Yes.
or ahead of a session before you've actually started.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have anything opposed to it, but it is a very much like, okay, we all stop for you to do your song. We all stop for you to do your poem. And it's not necessarily something that I adore, but I have seen instances where I was like, okay, as a one-off, it was pretty fun.
Yeah, and short and sweet. Make it punchy and effective. You don't want to give people homework. You want to give them something sweet to remind them of what their characters have done or what their motivations are or something like that.
Yeah. If you can keep it under 10 seconds, then I think it'll actually be appreciated.
Yeah, succinct and punchy. You want a punchline, not a page.
Yep. Well, I think that's what we've got on Bards. This has actually been a pretty long one.
Yeah, but it's necessary because this is an important episode. There is so much about the bard that is underrepresented.
Okay. Well, I hope you watching at home, you have seen how much we adore bards, and I hope that has kind of stoked the fires in you to love bards more. You may have had a huge amount of love, but hopefully something we said in there stoked the song in your heart to go and play bards or respect them more. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you on the next one.
Yeah, tell us in the comments whether our bardic inspiration was successful.
Yeah, let us know. We want to see how many successes we got. Right. Later, friends.
Later.